few Black Butler panels that's here. So we're doing both of them. We're doing the one tomorrow also. But hi, welcome. So happy to see everybody. This is our Black Butler upstairs downstairs panel. My name's Grelle. Just kidding. I figure we should just introduce ourselves first, and then we'll get started. That way people can have time to get in. My name is Kelley Frank. I work at the University of West Georgia. I'm an English professor. I have a master's degree in composition and rhetoric and creative writing. My specialty is focusing on gender issues, but also on the Victorian era. That's one of my pet interests. So as a Black Butler fan, I can't help but bring these kind of things in. So that's kind of where we go with that.
Hi, I'm April. You can call me Your Highness. Just kidding. I am a psychology major with a theater minor at Brunel University. I have been cosplaying for about 7 years now, and I've been cosplaying Black Butler specifically for about 4 to 5 years now. I also cosplay Sebastian. If you come to the panel tomorrow, you'll see me as Sebastian. That's actually what my badge says, is Sebastian Michaelis. Well, it says Sebastian Michael. Had to draw on the IS. But yeah, that's me.
Alright, and then hi, I'm Jordan Dixon. I'm a student at the University of Montevallo in Birmingham, Alabama. I am getting my degree in elementary education, and I've been cosplaying for about 7 years, Black Butler specifically for about 4 years.
So altogether, we comprise, well, with Undertaker over there manning the camera.
And Ciel, who was left at home.
Yes. Altogether, we comprise Black Knight Productions cosplay. So let's get into this, because I think you guys would probably, when we look at the Phantomhive manor, it's pretty easy to see Sebastian and everybody else all working together. But we need to make sure we let you guys know there will be spoilers. So if you have not read much in the manga, I am sorry. Please don't be sad. Don't kill us. I have a death sign.
If you haven't read up to chapter 129, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So just be aware of that, because it's really impossible for us to talk about this without discussing every little aspect of what Yana Toboso Sensei, the author of Black Butler, Kuroshitsuji, has really gone into. There's been a lot of developments that move beyond the anime, so if you've never read the manga, you're in for some interesting surprises. Use this picture. First of all, downstairs in the Victorian household. So are you guys familiar with what the term upstairs, downstairs means? Some people, not so much. Okay, so in the Victorian era, there were two separate spheres of existence. You had those who dwelt upstairs and those who dwelt downstairs. Yes. On the one hand, you have the wealthy aristocrats, and they get treated very differently from, I'm sorry, Mey-Rin.
Yeah.
From the servants. So we're going to go into some of these details and back and forth. But you might want to ask yourself, first of all, if you're reading all of this, why does Ciel need servants at all? He has a demon. And Sebastian seems like he could do everything, right? But in the Victorian era, if you didn't have servants, there was a problem if you were of the upper class. You had to have servants. That was seen as a sign of social status, because the idea was that someone who was upper class would never do that kind of dirty work. It should be done by people who are not seen. They're just invisible, unseen hands. And for Mey-Rin, for example, taking her in and making her into a maid would be seen as a sign of good Christian charity in Victorian England, particularly. So, hi, Bassie. Out of your sight. I'll see you later. So, but yeah, for for women in particular, the alternative to working as in the service industry was homelessness or prostitution, or working in the workhouses, which would sometimes work people to death. So being a servant was considered a good thing to be, even if it was very hard work, as we will see. I'm gonna apologize to Mey-Rin a lot. You should apologize to Mey-Rin too, Eloise.
She's not my maid.
You're in the manor all the time.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you guys to think about this a little bit. Question time. Who has the hardest job? Not Sebastian. He's not human. He's a demon. He can snap his fingers and make a manor appear. So, of the human people, who has the hardest times? Naka, Snake, Bard, Finny, Mey-Rin? We're gonna let you guys decide. But, I mean, Sebastian's a demon. He can do all kinds of stuff. He has magic powers.
And thank God, because otherwise the household would probably run into the ground.
Yes. Which, as we will see, there's 5 human servants. Some of them have special powers, magic eyes, and snake thingies. I don't know. What's Snake's power? He's a druid? I don't know.
Some of them just sit there and sip tea and occasionally offer exposition for the plot.
Yeah. Finny, who's basically,
Cries all the time.
yeah. Poor Finny. Alright, so, servants. You see these little bells? Servants would be so used to them. They came in a lot of handy during the murder arc, if you recall. But each bell had a different tone, a different sound. Servants could be summoned anytime, and that could be 24/7. You could be summoned at any moment and have to go and attend to whatever Eloise needed. I'm sorry, Mey-Rin.
Fluff my pillow.
No.
No.
Servants worked 12-hour days. They had no weekends. There were no protections for them in terms of labor rights or workers' rights. A person would sometimes start in service as young as maybe like 8 or 9 years old, and they could be in it for their whole lives. And this was all they knew, and this was what they were expected to do with their entirety of their existence, basically, just devoted entirely to service. Sometimes staying at the same house, but sometimes moving between houses. Many of them lived on the property, like Mey-Rin and the rest, but others had to come in from the townships or villages because, as we'll see, sometimes there were a lot of servants. Want to talk about this part? Since you usually, Sebastian?
Sure. So the head butler would be over the male servants in the household because there is no female house. Well, there's a housemaid.
There's a housemaid.
But not a Black Butler.
No.
There's not a head housemaid. Typically, there would be more maids. So we see Sebastian being over all of the servants. He's constantly having to manage all of them, as well as attend to his own job. Also, there would typically be other butlers. And the butler is the one who generally stays by his master, does whatever his master needs. Also, he helps advise him, and he's the go-between if the family upstairs has an issue or concern with the servants. If someone's not performing their duty properly, or if they need something and it's not being attended to, then he will address the issue with the servants. That's why he's kind of the head over them, but he's also the go-between. He's the servant who, if any of them were going to be seen, it would be him.
Yes.
And so he also he goes in between, and he could come in at any time, and the servants had to listen to him. So if any of them were being defiant, he could let them go, especially if the young lord doesn't like them.
Yeah.
And what they're doing, he can be like, no, you can leave.
He basically manages everything downstairs. So, I mean, that's pretty accurate for Sebastian, right? I mean, he manages everything.
And depending on the day, he manages everything upstairs.
Oh, yeah, that's true. But he typically just manages everything that we see. Then we get to the footman. Oh, Snake. Poor Snake. One thing about the footman, and Mrs. Beaton, her book of household management this was a book that was used by most Victorian households to see how a proper household should be run. The footman was supposed to be seen and not heard, and usually they were hired based on whether they were hot. They were supposed to be attractive men, and if they had to be a certain height, maybe about 6 feet or taller, because they were hired for looks. They were basically just people being used as decorative objects. So, poor Snake. He answers directly to Sebastian. He's supposed to serve food, take coats, refill drinks, open carriage doors, basically just young men. Now you might ask yourself, hey, what happens whenever they get to be older? And that's a good question. Because if they're too old to be in service, then there was no retirement plan. Because there were no protections for people.
Basically, Tanaka is only able to live in the household now because Ciel is letting him.
Yeah, basically. Ciel could have easily put him out on the street if he wanted to.
If you're caught up on the manga, you might think that he would like to have done that.
Oh, wee. And then we have the cook. You may think that Bard is... I mean, he's pretty bad at his job, but... And Sebastian has to work very hard to be good at his job because he doesn't know how human food tastes. But it's also pretty interesting because usually there would be a lot of people underneath Bard. He would be the head cook, and there would be levels of people, including a scullery maid whose sole job was to clean out pots and pans, scrub the floors, scrub out chamber pots.
Not fun.
The places where the poop goes, they did not often have indoor toilets. So that was the scullery maid's job. And if someone had an indoor toilet, it was going to be the wealthy people and not the servants. So scullery maid would clean out everybody's chamber pots.
Toilets are amazing.
Usually they were children, scullery maids were. That was the entry-level job. So imagine some little girl about 8 years old trying to do all that stuff. And then you get to more sophisticated levels under the head cook, like the pastry chef, who did nothing but specialize in pastries and cakes and ice creams and jellies and that sort of thing. So there would be one person who did each of these things. Sebastian's amazing and does everything, but normally you'd have more people than just Bard and Sebastian working.
Or you just have all of your servants be demons.
That's true. Or you... Eloise takes the funny way around. Okay, so let me show you guys. We have a little clip here to show you, to sort of illustrate this, about what the scullery maid's typical life was like.
Harriet Smith was the scullery maid at Hatfield House in 1846. Her role was one of the hardest ones in the kitchen and one of the least well paid, earning her a salary of £10 a year. She had to be the first up out of bed every morning to clean the kitchen range, and she was responsible for many of the physically demanding and unpleasant tasks in the kitchen, including washing the pots, scrubbing the floors and scouring the copper pans. She also helped the kitchen maids with preparing vegetables and plucking game. Following the visit, Harriet was promoted to kitchen maid and spent part of her time at Arlington Street, the Marquis of Salisbury's London residence. No doubt her early experience of the grand occasion of the Queen's visit made a lasting impression on this young scullery maid.
And the thing to think about is there are no scullery maids. There's only one maid, so...
And that maid is...
Me.
Yeah, it's you. I'm sorry.
Or Hannah. Maybe
So
I
also
should.
me.
Maybe I shouldn't have poked her eye out.
So then we have Finny. Now Finny, this is actually pretty funny because when you don't think of Finny, you think of him as being sort of bumbling, crying, always messing things up. Well, Finny would have had multiple jobs. And usually there'd be a lot of other people besides just one person taking care of the gardens. You would have a groundskeeper, which I'm assuming is what Finney is supposed to be, managing the flora, the fauna, taking care of any kind of decorative plant life.
Especially if you're like me and have a giant maze.
Why are you having so extra?
Compensation.
Well, okay. But one thing you'd also have, Ciel, does he have horses?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so who takes care of them? I can't even imagine him, like, taking care of horses. So one thing that's interesting about horse keeping is that you're supposed to carefully breed horses.
Just imagine that with Finney for a moment.
You're supposed to, when they're not, you're supposed to castrate them. Is that right? Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
If they were male and you already had a stallion or a gelding, you would need to, as someone who works with horses.
So, I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine Finney doing this on a regular basis.
Or Sebastian, really.
It's probably Sebastian taking care of the horses. And then you'd have a gamekeeper. Now, do you remember when Ciel and Francis go out for a hunt on the grounds? Somebody who is the gamekeeper would have had to be keeping the grounds, making sure that all of the animal life is well cared for, so that there's plenty of animal life for the master and mistress to be able to hunt. You want to keep them alive so you can kill them. So someone has to do this, and British tradition, I mean, you had for fox hunting and stuff like that, you had to make sure those kind of animals were on the property. Pheasants, deer, all that sort of thing. So, imagine, if you will, Finney having to do all of this. He's having to take care of the flowers, he's having to castrate horses, he's having to make sure that the pheasants are properly breeding in the woods. He's got a weird job. A very weird job for one person.
I'm just trying to imagine him keeping game life up and then knowing that they're going to be killed.
He would cry. Poor baby.
He doesn't know that though.
He doesn't
He
know.
will when it's brought home for Bard to cook. Or
Yeah. It just, poor Finney. Poor Finney. Okay. And then we get to Mey-Rin. We get to the maid. Oh, she's so happy to be a maid now.
That's because of the nice clothes.
Yeah.
Notice it says a maid, not the only maid.
Yeah, okay, so basically we included the diary of William Taylor, who was a footman in the Victorian era. Basically, he wrote about how being a servant was something like, he says, being a bird shut up in a cage, you're well housed, you're well fed, you're well taken care for, but you have no freedom. Because you basically are working for these people all the time, you live for them, and your whole life goes for these individuals. That's basically the case with Mey-Rin. In a house, any kind of a house that was higher than middle class, you would have more than one maid. Even the middle classes would have 2 or 3 maids.
What are you trying to say about me?
Throwing some shade your way. There would usually, for a manor house this large, there might be upwards of 20 maids, because you have to include the scullery maids who are cleaning out the chamber pots, all the way to the maids that are making the beds and doing the laundry and all of that. There's washing, ironing, mending, dusting. You did not have automatic hot water, so someone had to gather the water, boil it, and bring it upstairs so that someone can take a bath. Ciel. There were many, many tasks that had to be done. Washing itself was very difficult. Doing the laundry was time-consuming. We benefit from clothing that is easily cleanable, but in that time period, it was far more difficult. Let's say that Alois, spills something on his coat.
Gosh darn it.
Gosh darn it. Hannah would have to take the coat completely apart, seam by seam, wash the bit that was dirty, and that would often require using a washing board. So if you've ever seen the boards, you have to scrub things like that. That's how things were washed. And
There
then
was
she would
not a
have-
washing machine
There's no-
for you to...
You
are
were the washing machine.
Yeah.
And then she would have to hang it up. She'd have to iron it, press it, and then stitch it back together again so that he can wear it. Because most of these garments were not made to be washed.
Kind of like cosplay sometimes.
I hear you. So
Back at the house, the poor maids had no time for sightseeing. With the royal party in residence, there would have been even more work to do than usual. At the laundry, the work was back-breaking. The maids would fill a laundry copper, which heated the water. This meant carrying hundreds of back-breaking buckets in from the yard. Shugborough House still boasts a 19th century laundry, and it's now used to demonstrate how the work was done back then. So how much extra work would there have been because of the royal visit?
Oh, it would have been double or treble. We'd have needed extra help coming in from the village because of all the bed linen and then extra tablecloths. They'd need napkins, make an awful lot of washing.
What sort of hours did they work?
They work 12-hour days starting at 5 a.m. in the morning, working 6.5 days a week.
Only half a day
On
off.
Sunday to go to church and 1 day off a month.
That is not much, is it?
Not a lot.
So was there a weekly routine here for the maids?
The main washing would be through from Monday till Tuesday, and then from Wednesday to Friday it would be the ironing, the folding and the airing. Then Saturday and Sunday was sorting all the dirty washing and then start all over again.
A 12-hour day was pretty demanding for the servants, and the work would have been more daunting had Shugborough not invested in some of the latest gizmos and gadgets to help ease the laundry maid's pain.
When Victoria was here, this was the latest piece of equipment. It's called a dolly peg, and it's just twist and turn like this, backwards and forwards. We say 100 turns for each load of washing.
100 turns.
100 turns.
But the dolly peg was luxury on legs compared to the old washboard, as I'm about to find out.
You need to rub the cloth up and down on the wooden slats using your knuckles.
Knuckles? Imagine doing this all day long.
I think you'll make an excellent maid.
Oh, it's coming off too. It's brilliant, it's working. Just as I've mastered Victorian washing, there's still the ironing to do. And believe it or not, this is what they would have used for all the extra laundry. What is this contraption? It looks like something out of a torture chamber.
I know it does. It's called a box mangle, and it's an ironing machine. We use it to iron all the large flat items like sheets and tablecloths that would take a very long time with a hot iron.
The many tablecloths required for Victoria's visit would have been wound around these two rollers, which were placed under the weighted box. The other way. So how many people would have manned this?
Ideally you need 3 people, the handyman to operate the machine and 2 maids putting the cloth on and off the rollers. I think you can stop now, Rosemary.
Oh, thank goodness for modern irons.
They would get off early in Sunday morning to go to church.
that was
But
your
after-
only time off.
Yeah.
Did
that was-
Sebastian go?
Does Claude go?
Does your whole household go?
Probably.
But it was normally only if you were like of the upper, like the upper class. It wasn't most people. You just like most of your lower class nobles only had had to just hang up things. They didn't have the press to
Yeah.
help
They-
dry.
And so if you think about that, also it would be unseemly to hang your clothing outside to dry if you were a wealthy house. So you would have to hang it inside, especially undergarments. Nobody wants to see a wealthy earl's underpants blowing in the breeze.
You really don't.
So you had to have space inside the house to be able to hang those up. So there's a lot of space issues, and there's a lot of time and effort put in for a lot of different levels for people. So let me ask you guys a question. Where's Ciel's servants?
Where are my servants?
Where are they? Because if you were talking about Phantomhive Manor, for the size it is, it should have, on average, about 30 servants permanently on staff. And that's not including people who would come in from a village to come and help. So if we're also talking about seasonal work in the spring and summer, you would need people to come in for extra work like trimming hedges and weeding flower beds, and every time you'd have somebody come in with a carriage up that gravel path, someone has to go and rake that to make it look perfect. If it rains, you've got to apply more gravel and rake it again. All that has to be immaculate all the time. So you'd have extra people come in from the local village to come and help. If you have socializing or entertaining, someone has to do the laundry for all those extra guests. So remember the murder arc where they almost ran out of food in the house? They also had to change those sheets every single day. Hi, Mey-Rin.
Not fun.
I wouldn't want to change the sheets for a Lao. It's opium all over the bed. You would have extra maids for parties. You may even have you'd have all your footmen, and oftentimes people would bring their own servants with them to come and stay. So, for example, let's say that Aloise went to go and visit Ciel and spend time in the place. He would probably bring Hannah and Claude in order to attend to his particular needs, because that was considered the proper way to do things, so you didn't overburden the host household by having their servants do extra work. The problem is that you have more mouths to feed, more people to take care of, they have to have places to sleep. So you have a lot of different logistical issues. Now, if we look into when Vincent Phantomhive was Earl, this is from one of the recent manga chapters, we see there were lots of servants. This is when Ciel's being born. There were maids everywhere. Look at all these people. Tons of them. And they're all concerned. Oh no, is Rachel Phantomhive going to be okay? She's giving birth soon, and they're praying for her. But look at how many maids there are. Rushing hot water and towels and sheets everywhere.
Vincent Phantomhive knew what was up.
Yeah. So, here are some of the differences. If the typical noble Victorian home had upwards of 30 servants, what does this say about Ciel as an earl and his knowledge of running an earldom? Is this a specific choice that Yana Toboso is making to have less servants? Is that, because honestly that'd be a lot of characterization to have to do. You'd have to make like a bunch of characters. Or does this say something about Ciel maybe not knowing how to run a household, and Sebastian doesn't know how to run a household, and so they're just kind of winging it? Why has Sebastian not suggested more servants? Well, would it threaten his cover? What if they started questioning his methods? We already know he does things like spin casually and prevent tons and tons of champagne from falling, and catches glasses randomly and does all kinds of crazy Sebastian things. So that should be pretty suspicious.
Another thought is, does Yana do this specifically to use the characters for comic relief because of their mess-ups? If there were more servants, we wouldn't see that as much, but she tends to use the servants as a comic relief moment a lot, except for when they're defending the manor.
Yeah. When we see Mey-Rin mistake shoe polish for the banister, it's really funny, but when you think of like she should have 29 other people helping her, then I would be pretty tired too and maybe mistake the wrong thing at that point, especially since she can't see very well, and she hasn't been born a servant. You kind of started doing it, so it's a more difficult sort of situation to get into. Aloise, would you like to talk about the place you're more familiar with?
Phantomhive Manor?
No. The upstairs.
So, one of the major things about Ciel that he mentions a lot is his last name, Phantomhive, the legacy behind it, their duty as a family, and specifically as the Earl Phantomhive being the Queen's watchdog. And so, looking at his Phantomhive crest, of the crest of the family, these were very important for the family. Each thing on there symbolizes something about the family. So, if you press it, it should come. No. So if we look at the shield, it normally means that the family was involved in military in some way, especially if we think about it with how we have to question how they became nobility, because what would happen is the king or queen the family would do something, someone in the family, definitely a male, given the time period, would do something upstanding, and the king or queen of the time would recognize them for what they had done, and they could make them part of the peerage, which is the nobility, the aristocrat people of
raise them up from the common folk into the peerage.
Because until you were claimed and you were called out in court to be a noble, no matter how much money you had, you were not aristocracy. Yeah. You could be the most wealthy middle class person, but you would not have that title until the king or queen gave it to you. So one of the thoughts that I had on how the Phantomhive family came to be is, given the shield that they have, is perhaps King George was really, really liberal with how he gave out peerage titles. At the time, he was one of the most liberal kings or queens. He gave out over 80, which is really saying something.
King George was king during the American Revolution.
Yes, King George III.
So, yeah.
And so my thought was, well, perhaps they helped during the American Revolution. And that's how he named them to be earls. And so another thing is, if we look at the double-headed eagle, that usually means power, as well as the crown on top that's specifically for an earl. Each crest would have a different thing. If you're a baron, if you're a viscount, if you're a marquis, each crown would be slightly different based on the number of hearts on it, the sides of it. So yeah, the crest is very important. Each thing symbolizes something about the family. So another thing that's important is the family line.
Sorry about spoilers, guys.
Yes, sorry about that. So we don't know who Vincent's father is. There's been a lot of speculation that it could be Undertaker, but it has not been canonized yet. But we do know that Claudia Phantomhive was his mother, and Francis and Vincent are siblings, which is why Lizzie and Ciel are cousins, but that was not viewed negatively at the time. If you were any closer related, it would be taboo, but if you're cousins, that's okay. Mm-hmm. And so we see that we have Rachel and Madame Red. They were sisters. We don't know who their parents were. But we have the two twins. I'm sorry if you didn't know that. We warned there would be spoilers. So the thing is that Ciel, he was born second, and that was very important. Our Ciel was born second. And that's very important because it doesn't matter if it was a matter of minutes or anything. He was born second, and therefore he would not inherit the peerage. He would not inherit any title. He would not inherit anything.
Yeah. Basically, it would be up to his older brother whether or not he was allowed to stay in the household.
Yes, he could be kicked out.
He could be kicked out on the street. He could become penniless. He could be homeless. It would be up to his brother whether or not he wanted to keep him as anybody. So this was a time period in which the younger brother would have a very strong motivation to want to marry up, to try to find somebody who was already wealthy and had a title that they could marry into, whose family they could marry into. That would also be motivation for a lot of people to try to kill their older siblings. So make of that what you will. We don't know yet, but there's some serious speculation going on about that right now.
Yes, heritage was everything when it came to being nobility, because if you were either female or the younger sibling, you did not get anything. You did not have any of the rights as a noble. Mm-hmm. You had no title either. You would have to move out and find your own place. And this could also depend on the parents, because some parents would set up in their will a fund for the younger siblings, because there could be more than one. That way they would have money to start themselves up and be independent once the heir was named and they possibly had to move out. Other parents would not do anything. and you were on your own, and it was up to the generosity of your older sibling as to whether or not they gave you anything.
Yeah, so it's pretty cutthroat. And if we look at Elizabeth, for example, she is betrothed to Ciel. So basically they are, because they're engaged, they're practically married. They're not actually married, but they're as close as they could possibly be. She doesn't have any rights on her own, though. She belongs to her family, so her father and her brother, and to Ciel. She does not have her own agency. She couldn't just be like, I don't want to marry anybody, I'm going to go and live in the city. She could try to do that, but she wouldn't have any money and she wouldn't have any claim to anything. So it's a very different sort of system, but it's important to keep that kind of thing in mind when we're looking at this.
So, an overview of noble life, it was pretty nice. Nobles typically had no need to work. They didn't need to earn money. What they inherited was usually enough to cover them substantially. They were also guaranteed a seat in the House of Lords, so in Parliament during that time, and to this day you have the House of Lords, which is the upper part of Parliament. It's specifically seated nobles as well as the bishops of the time period. They're the temporal spirituals.
Yep. And these were people who made laws and basically deferred directly to the king and queen. So at this time period, when Queen Victoria is reigning, they would defer directly to Victoria. Because Prince Albert is dead at this point, she was the reigning monarch. There was no competition at all for who was in charge. She was the only one, and you had to defer directly to her. But the House of Lords would propose ideas, and the Queen would accept them, or she would reject them, and it was full of a lot of different political maneuvering to try to make sure that the Queen liked your idea better than Joe Bob's idea.
And they also reviewed any legislature that was passed by the House of Commons, which is the house where you had commoners and middle class people who were elected by the public to seat. But any legislature that they passed had to be approved by the House of Lords before it went on to the Queen.
So basically, the people who were part of the aristocracy answered directly to the Queen, and they had complete control over laws and control of the land. Now, this all sounds well and good, but because they're guaranteed a seat, they also have to maintain proper etiquette. There's this idea of noblesse oblige, which is obligation of the nobility. You are supposed to be, whatever you get, you're supposed to treat the lower classes well as a way of showing that you are chosen and have the right to maintain that high status. You also had things like the season, which was where you would go hunting for a lady to marry if you were a young man, or if you were a lady that wanted to get married and hoped to find someone to marry up with. You would go there and try to do your best to find a guy. And if you didn't do that within 4 seasons, you would be considered an old maid. So that's 4 years to find yourself a man. And typically that started when? Like about, 14, 15? Yeah.
It became typical for women to marry when they were older. Instead of 12 to 14, they would usually marry around 18. If you were past about 21, then you were an old maid, so about 4 years. But typically, the marriages were arranged by the family. Example, Ciel and Lizzie. Yeah. That was arranged by their parents.
That was very common, especially for cousins, because then you kept all the power in the family and the genetic disorders.
And another reason specifically for Ciel and Lizzie is it was a way to move up. So Lizzie is higher up than Ciel. Her family is higher up.
Which you wouldn't think of, but it's true because of her father.
They have a Marquis and a Marchioness, which is higher than an Earl. It's 1 rank higher, I believe.
Yep.
And so what the parents of Ciel, Vincent and Rachel, were attempting to do is move their family up.
And they already got Francis to help them, who was married to the Marquis, basically. So, Phantom Corporation. Basically, a noble could have a company and a way to make money, but they didn't have to. But this was typically seen as a good way to do it because, as you probably heard, the best way to make money is to have money. Take your money, you put it in, you make more money, money grows money. So they typically would do that and invest and stuff like that.
This doesn't mean that the noble had to be really active in his company,
No.
like a small business owner would be.
That's work.
Whereas a middle-class artisan would not typically be able to hire a bunch of advisors and managers and employees. Most of the work would be on him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If someone like Ciel can hire advisors and CEOs and whatever else to oversee it.
He doesn't even have to walk into the place.
No.
And he can reap all the benefits of it, basically.
And Sebastian can just come to him and be like, here's where our prices are, here's how sales are going. He's
sign
like,
this, and this, and you're good. And he's like,
Yes.
okay. And that's it.
However, the owner was responsible for negotiating trade agreements. We see this in one of the very first episodes where he's negotiating about having a small chunk of his company be, I think, in Italy.
Yep. He also tries to attain a royal warrant in order to make it so that his particular brand is seen by the queen as the best. And that usually meant that you would get more people coming in, and that means more money for Ciel because he likes to cash. So that was typically a thing that nobles like to do, is find ways to grow money in that sort of fashion.
Okay, so going back to the House of Lords. So the House of Lords had the Lords Spiritual and the Lords Temporal. The Lords Spiritual were the bishops who would be there.
Basically the spiritual guides.
Yes.
And then Lords Temporal were people within like the physical plane. So you'd have the church and you'd have the peerage, basically.
So as we said, they would review bills passed by the House of Commons because they could not go through without the House of Lords approval,
House of Commons for commoners.
Which this sort of kept the system in of the aristocrats being able to kind of control what laws were passed. But one of the things that happened is that in 1868, the House of Lords changed to where those who were seated did not have a vote if they did not take the trouble to attend. And as we've seen, Ciel does not go.
So Ciel basically has a chance to vote for things, but he doesn't seem like he cares that much about his country or maintaining any sort of or participating, really. He just kind of doesn't show up. So one of the questions that we asked was, does he know how that works?
Because this was also a very, very hot time between the Whigs and the Tories. There was a lot of political change going on, a lot of political turmoil. So
basically then, image was everything, and that meant servants. That meant that you had lots of parties. That meant that you dressed a particular way and you had to present yourself in a very particular way. You can find, I mean, we could go all day about etiquette, but there were etiquette guides particularly for how one behaved at parties, how one behaved for certain individuals. There was a whole secret language of how to use fans to communicate with people because you weren't allowed to talk to someone when you first met them. You had to be introduced. Being a lady was tough because you couldn't just walk up to a hot guy and be like, why, hello. You had to have someone introduce you, and you had to be chaperoned constantly. So imagine going on a date with your parents and their friends. That's awkward. But that was how it was for nobility. Basically, you were never alone. You had people around you constantly. Servants, chaperones. People were constantly around you to make sure you were okay. And to make sure that you didn't do anything untoward. And if you did, you best bet that everyone was going to gossip about it. So you had to constantly be on your best behavior. Basically, the way the paparazzi works for celebrities right now is how it was at the time. You were constantly observed by everyone, and gossip was rampant. Ladies were held to a particularly high standard, and if they were caught alone with a man, or if she spoke to a man without being introduced, her whole reputation could be ruined. she would not be able to marry anyone, and as we've seen, because women were seen as property and didn't have any voting rights or anything like that, they would not have anything they could do. They'd end up on the streets or have to go into service industry or go turn into prostitution. That could happen for even upper class women.
Just check it out for 10 minutes.
So when the season came around, we see that the season is happening during the beginning of the Jack the Ripper arc. That's when the Ripper was ripping. I wonder why. But we see that Madame Red is enjoying the season because this was a time of a lot of parties. But for young people, it was a time of great stress because they had X amount of time to hook up. And if they didn't make a match, then they would have a lot of trouble down the road financially.
And women, young ladies, such as Elizabeth, could not attend until they were presented at court to the queen. This was called coming out.
Like, you had to physically go and see the queen herself. You couldn't just be like, hey, I want to go dating. It's
Yes.
like, no, you have to go see Queen Victoria and be introduced to her. And then everyone would know that you were eligible on the marriage market to meet people and find
Until that moment, until you came out, you were not seen as a young woman. You were still a little girl. It
Yep.
does not matter how old you were, but you would have to be presented
Mm-hmm.
at court for you to be eligible to marry. Otherwise, you were still a kid.
Yeah. So there was a great focus then on this idea of eligibility, and it basically was a marriage market in the sense of we're trying to figure out whose daughters are going to get pushed where. If you've ever seen something like Pride and Prejudice or any of those sorts of, that's basically the same sort of thing. So, if you were unmarried, you needed to always be in the company of a relative or a fiance. You had to marry within your class. So Ciel, for example, could not, when he went into to the circus, if he had decided that he really liked some young lady he met there, he would never be able to do anything with them because he has to work within his social class. And if you're thinking, well, what if he really likes Eloise? Well, that's completely out of the question because this was a time period where anything that was not cisgender, heterosexual, any kind of relationship like that, if it was public, then it was punished. And we're talking castration or being put to death. So it was a bad time to be LGBTQ.
It's a bad time to be a woman.
It was a bad time to be a trans lady. Thanks very much.
Why not both?
Poor girl, misgendered everywhere. But yeah, once Elizabeth gets married, everything she has belongs to Ciel. She doesn't get to own anything, and her duties are always to be a loyal wife, caring mother, and that's it. If she does anything else, that's always at her husband's whim. Her biggest accomplishment is to bear children. Hi, Madame Red, who could not bear children.
And that's one reason that Madame Red was seen as an outcast, especially because she could not bear heirs.
Once Madame Red no longer had a uterus and was incapable of bearing children, she was seen as a non-woman. She was seen as not really a person in society. So if you think of it that way, when you're looking at the Jack the Ripper arc, when she and Grelle are sort of bonding over this idea of, yes, we're not really seen as women, we're not seen as members of society, it makes more sense that way because Madame Red really was seen like that because she could not bear children. Now, when we come back, circling all this back, now we looked at the upstairs and we looked at the downstairs. When we think of these two worlds interacting, the upper class did not interact with their servants because their servants are not seen as important to that sphere of existence.
Unless they're the only friends you have.
Well, Eloise, you're sad, okay? You're just sad.
And dead.
Well, darn. Well, hey, we're in the same boat. Yes, team dead. But basically, the wealthy did not even like to see servants unless they were like the footman, who was supposed to be hot, or the butler, who was supposed to be the go-between. Those were the only types of servants that they liked to see. So when we think about Black Butler, we know that Yana Toboso Sensei has done tons and tons of research, but we also know that she's dealing with some difficulties because, first of all, the complexities of the peerage system are rough. We've just scratched the surface, and you see how confusing it can be. She's having to gather all this information from books that she's having to have translated from English into Japanese so that she can read them. She does not speak English, and she has to have people translate it for her. So this is complicated. Only recently has she introduced the idea of the tenants, the people who live in the nearby village. If you remember the Halloween special, we finally saw them. We were like, hey, there's people in a village. Oh my gosh, they have tenants. Like a real manor house. Golly. So there have been questions in the fan about whether that is something she planned or if she just suddenly was like, oh, darn, I probably should have had this here. Let me just knock that in there. And then we have the very small staff. Again, this could be a style or tone choice, or it could be something that she's just deciding that she doesn't want to have to deal with it and isn't too worried about the historical accuracy. But in either case, it does characterize Ciel. He values privacy. And privacy at the expense of having his household run properly like it should. We came to the conclusion, after doing all this research, that probably it's because as the younger brother, our Ciel was probably never taught how to properly run a household.
He would not probably have been taught because he would not be the one inheriting the household.
So he wouldn't know. And Sebastian is a demon. He doesn't know. Sebastian, we see early on, he's reading books trying to learn how. He actually has a copy of Mrs. Beaton's Guide to Household Management, and he's reading it because he's trying to learn. So that book was written for the middle classes because it was assumed that the upper classes would already know things. So he's trying to piece this together, and RCL is trying to figure things out. But pretty much we have the blind leading the blind in this case.
And this is why we see in the flashback in the Book of the Atlantic arc that Sebastian's saying we have to learn quickly. We are not yet a butler and an earl. Mm-hmm. Because when Ciel goes to court and is presented before the queen and he gains the title and land because that would have been in the queen's hands since there was no heir conceivably at the time. Sebastian's like, before we do that, we have to have this figured out and look like we are the people that we say we are. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we're not going to get it because we're not going to look like an earl and a butler.
So that's the conclusion we came to. But we've got some time for some questions. Does anybody have any? Yes.
Okay. My question is for Mey-Rin. So every time Sebastian does something very kawaii, as you put it in one episode, your nose, please. What do you think of Sebastian times Halloween, Sebastian times Grelle, or Sebastian times Ciel?
So I actually, as Mey-Rin, do not find Sebastian and Mey-Rin as a ship. It's not my favorite. It's mainly because there would be no reason for Sebastian and Mey-Rin to really have a relationship other than as fellow servants, especially as Sebastian being higher than Mey-Rin is.
She has the hots for him, but I mean, she's also living a very, the only guys around are, they can swim, okay? we've got Captain Burns everything, Mr. Cries a lot, and a guy that's covered in scales. I mean, it's like
not a lot of great options.
And you've got to think about these are the only people that she's really going to see except for a few seconds when she's out on the town.
Yeah,
so.
she's basically, it's either that or killing people. That's she doesn't get much exposure to social interactions. So, which is kind of sad to think about, but yeah, I mean, if she sees Sebastian doing something attractive, like, power to her for having a moment of being like, yeah, he's hot, because she doesn't get that very often. Anybody else have a yes?
So you say about the shortage of servants and stuff is probably because of Ciel's lack of social status. But why do you think she would pick such clumsy and low?
I honestly think it's for comic relief.
So yeah, a lot of it is also because Yana chooses to, like, she chooses certain people as Ciel's servants. Mm-hmm. And there's specifically people who did not grow up being servants. Like, for instance, Mey-Rin was an assassin before. She has no knowledge of what a servant is supposed to do, what a maid is supposed to look like.
Or how to do it.
Yeah, or how to do it. So it's very much like them figuring out how to do their jobs. And they're still learning. The same as Sebastian and Ciel have to learn how to do their job.
Mm-hmm. The killers first. We can take one more question real fast, but then we'll... Oh, no. You sure? Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, so Ciel's aunt is a doctor.
Yes.
And,
oh, and she got so much. Got so much.
And his
shade.
tailor is a woman who wears shorts, and he's friends with a girl who invented mustard gas.
Yes.
What do you think of the decision to surround him with all these like really non-conformist women?
I think that probably Yana's trying to critique the system from the Victorian era, because she's looking at it from a person now. I mean, she's got a trans woman as one of the Reapers. We've also got Sasha, whose gender is not confirmed. Sasha's often seen as gender fluid. We've got a lot of characters who are kind of all over the place, and so there's a lot of good representation in there. And I do think, I mean, she's probably critiquing it. There's a lot to critique from the Victorian era, and there's a lot for us to... we tend to see it nostalgically, but everybody wants to be the wealthy people. Nobody imagines themselves as being like the servant, whereas most of us would be, unfortunately. So, yeah, I personally think that's probably what she's doing, is critiquing the system. So, but yeah. Well, we hope you guys enjoyed it.